Hello again, everybody. You've heard a lot from me already today, so I appreciate the opportunity to chat specifically about these tools. I'm Cameron Dale, the director of the League of Cities and Towns, and we represent all the cities and towns at the Capitol and then provide them in training and resources. And so looking forward to talking about these tools today.
I'm Lacey Richards with Nielsen Land and Nielsen Homes. We are a regional builder up in mostly Davis, Weber, Box Elder County area, and here to talk about one of the specific tools that we're utilizing in our master plan development that incorporates starter homes.
Great, thanks everyone. And I'm Wade Budge. I'm a dirt lawyer, and what that means is we get involved in finance a lot. So they asked me to help present part of this, and so I want to thank each of the panelists for providing a lot of content for this meeting today. So if you go onto the Utah Land Use Institute website, Craig Call and his team have put together a list of about 25 different methods to finance infrastructure. And included within that list are some of the items we're going to talk about today. But what we wanted to focus on is not that list of 20, but we want to focus on these key 5 items. And there's a reason why we're targeting them. One is because 2 of them are current tools that are being used. 2 of them are brand new and are starting to be used, as you're going to hear from our panelists. And then there's an upcoming one. There's one that's actually been passed, but there are some tweaks that are going to get made before it gets implemented. So this kind of gives you an idea of where we're going in today's discussion. We're going to talk about all these acronyms, and by the end, this alphabet soup of acronyms will hopefully start to have a little bit more meaning for each of you. And then we'll find ways that hopefully you can make these of use in your cities, counties, and in your projects. So as we start, we always start with the why. Why are we doing all this? And what we found is that there are kind of these principles that we're always facing. And the first is that capital needs a return. I don't care where we go, whenever you're going to bring in capital, it needs a return. And that's actually kind of a good thing, because I guess the reverse is it's communism. So anyway, that's something that we all have to deal with. But the other concept that we have to deal with is that if we lower the cost of money, it creates circumstances for lower product cost. And what I hear from the kid in my basement is saving up for his first house, and what I hear from my friends and others is that things are expensive. So as we're trying to think of ways to make this more available, make it so we can deliver product more affordably to people, we need to talk in terms of what are those tools. And some of the tools we're going to talk about are not limited only to housing, because housing is multidimensional. You'll have multifamily, which is often incorporated into a larger commercial project. So we're going to talk about how these tools can be employed in a number of different ways. In the prior session that was offered by Gary Crane and some other panelists, they talked about how delays can create costs, and that's true. That's very much true. That's another axiom, if you will, that projects hate delays. And then the other item is that higher costs and all these things all influence price. And so the goal today is to start talking about how it is we can nibble away at this set of issues. And what we're going to talk about is how financing can help reduce the cost of infrastructure and the cost to build. So this is a slide that we've used in some prior presentations, but been updated. And I want to just turn some time over to Benj. Benj, can you kind of walk us through about how it is, because I think it's helpful whether you're on the developer side or on the city or county side to kind of get an understanding of how these issues are presented and how these issues are analyzed. And you want to kind of just walk us through what we see here?
Absolutely. On the left side of the screen there, you can see those fixed development costs. And really, there's not a lot there that developers can do to change the price of materials, of labor, land, certainly if they've come into land early, but if it's an open and even market, typically you have several bidders that you're going to come up with a fairly similar land price. And then permits also fitting within that fixed development cost. So as much as we talk about being able to lower the price of homes or to limit the market increases on homes so that we can create maybe more affordable circumstances, there's not a lot that can be done on those fixed development costs. One area where there is influence is the cost of financing. This is very similar. I mean, if you were, in most simple terms, if you were to go and maybe buy a TV from a store, you pay for it in cash. You could pay for it, some sort of money down program. You could pay for it with a high yielding credit card. You could pay it all off, over 6 months. I mean, all of that is going to influence the total cost that you paid for that TV. Same thing here on financing infrastructure or financing developments is the cost of financing with and without a public financing tool. If the public financing tools are not available, typically funding that infrastructure or that construction happens through typical construction loans, equity, which can be very expensive. When there are public finance tools, it allows for that money to be notably cheaper. So overall, your ultimate costs of development end up being cheaper if there are public finance tools available, and those are some of the tools we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Benj. And I think there was one other thing we talked about today, which is, we may note that, and it's not up on the slide, but it kind of came up in our prep session. But if you know, a lot of times it's easy to just default to the point where you think, okay, well, when the Fed reduces interest rates, everything will magically work out. And what we're trying to explain is that's not the case. And there's a couple of reasons for it, and I'm not quite sure why, but I think it has something to do with the bond market, and it has something to do with long-term rates, and the fact that those things aren't controlled by the Fed. But I know, Benj, do you want to just kind of add to that and help us understand why it's important for us to focus on finance?
Sure. Yeah, so many different factors there, not just if the Fed is reducing rates, does that make cheaper rates for everyone? There are geopolitical influences, there are larger just macro market influences. There's still risks associated with the future state of the economy. Are we, what's the situation in the Middle East and Russia? Right now, a major risk that exists in the bond market is election, right? What's going to happen with the election is are we going to have undetermined results for a period of time that will create uncertainty? And markets typically don't like uncertainty. So
What's your prediction? No.
Yeah.
Okay, never
Let's
mind.
open that up.
Never mind.
That's right.
It causes people maybe to sit on the sidelines, which ultimately is not a great position for capital markets. Capital markets need lots of people being active in the market, trading money, investing money, putting money to use, as opposed to being cautious and scared about results or uncertain and keeping it on the sidelines. So a declining rate environment, while oftentimes causes people to put their money to use, there are also other influences that are at play.
That's helpful. So when we start getting into what we have as the tools here, we're going to highlight first this HTRZ tool, which is only 4 or 5 years old, but now has started to be implemented, and we're starting to see some of the fruit. And the reason why I like this presentation today is sometimes in land use, it's about pitting positions, but developer against city or what have you. When you're talking about finance, it's the opposite. It's about how it is that the two groups can try and work together to come up with a better result for the community. And this HTRZ tool is one that is now starting to get some traction, and I thought maybe we could ask Cam to just tell us what he's been hearing from his members about HTRZ and some of the hopes that exist for this tool.
Perfect, thanks, Wade. How many of you are familiar with HTRZs? Just to see the audience, about half, and a couple of hands that are partially up in the air. HTRZ is a tool that the legislature enacted 4 years ago now that is just now starting to bear fruit. And I want to emphasize something that Wade just said. I think it's remarkable that we're having this conversation about financing tools that bring developers and cities together to pay for infrastructure to unlock housing units. And major credit to state leaders for working with us collectively and being creative on these tools. HTRZs is a tax increment financing tool. Tax increment financing is actually not allowed in multiple states in the United States. So let that just set in for a second. This conversation is basically over if we were in the state of Arizona, because they don't allow, or California and elsewhere, because they don't allow for tax increment financing. So after this past legislative session, I met with a bunch of state league directors from across the West, all of whom were dealing with housing challenges, all of whom were dealing with the challenges of the state wants to do X and local governments want to push back. And they were all blown away when I sat down with them and said, let me show you everything we've done for the last few years here, both on the financing side and otherwise, because it just isn't really happening elsewhere. So I just wanted to applaud the development community for coming to the table and being creative and figuring out these tools, and state lawmakers, governor's office. We have Tara from the governor's office here, and we've even though it's been hard, it's been very collaborative. And this type of workshop couldn't happen in a lot of states. So that being said, HTRZ was one of the first specific tools. We've always had, I shouldn't say always, we've had tax increment financing for a long time. Every year the legislature tweaks it. And tax increment financing, for those of you who don't know, you're basically creating a revenue stream based on the projected increase in the value of the property. So you've got a piece of ground now that's generating, for conversation purposes, $1 in tax increment. If you invest in that space, over time, maybe it'll generate $50 of tax increment. And so you can bond against that projected value to then pay for the infrastructure to invest in the ground to then bring up that value. Fair enough? Okay. So again, that concept has been around in Utah for a while, but the HTRZ was really the first time it was specifically focused on a specific area with housing as a centerpiece. Housing has been kind of an add-on for RDAs and redevelopment agencies and other tax increment financing, but HTRZ was specifically focused at areas within a third of a mile of a transit stop, and was specifically focused to maximize the land use and specifically focused on getting housing at a very high density. And when I say very high density, I'm talking very high density by Utah standards, but at least 50 units to the acre within a certain percentage near that, within a third of a mile of that HTRZ. So when it first passed, there was a lot of hesitation and back and forth, and will anybody use this tool? And there was a lot of interest and questions, but we didn't know 4 years ago where we would be. And I am proud to report that now 4 years down the line, not only do we have 7 communities that have gone through that HTRC process and others that are interested in it, it became the foundation for a lot of what we did this past legislative session to expand those principles and build on them for other areas.
No, I think that's well said and summarized. And what I think is important to think about is that, oftentimes people are concerned when you get into the higher density ranges about traffic. And one of the ideas, one of the functions here is to say, okay, well, we are investing heavily as a state in these transit opportunities. Let's make sure we really achieve those higher densities when you're around a front runner stop, a BRT stop, or a track stop. And there's slightly different criteria that apply, and they sometimes get tweaked from year to year. But we have some of the key terms on the screen right now, and this relates to, this has to be an application initiated by the city. And then the advantage is if you get it approved by GOEO, the school district's increment comes along. You don't have to go and negotiate an interlocal with the school district. The county's increment comes along. You don't have to go negotiate an interlocal with the county. I guess you can go all the way down to the mosquito district. But anyway, that increment already comes over and is administered by the city, typically their RDA, and then made available for the project goals. And GOEO, when it goes and considers whether to approve a project, it usually puts together a committee of about 10 to 11. There's an identified list of stakeholders that have to be in that meeting. And all these other taxing entities are there. And so the goal of a project proponent who's wanting to get an HTRZ approved is to try and make sure they're going to address those concerns of those committee members with their project plan. And what you'll see, if you go back to the prior slide, what you'll see is that right now, these 7 projects have entitled 42,000 units, more than 42,000 units, including 5,700, more than 5,700 affordable units. And so you're getting some affordable product in the pipeline for development as part of these projects.
Well, can I jump in here?
Please.
Because I want to put an exclamation point on this. Part of the reason we built out this HTRZ process was because there had been tension throughout the years of the other property taxing entities who, justifiably so, were anxious about giving up their future tax increment and property tax growth. An average property tax bill in the state of Utah is about 12% city, 88% everybody else. Mm-hmm. And the lion's share of that 88% is the school district. And for those of you who have school bonds on the ballot in a couple of weeks, that's a whole other conversation that we can have later. But the school district is very dependent on property tax. Cities rely on property tax, but when you sit down with the other property taxing entities, this is a very tricky conversation. And I don't fault any taxing entity for wanting to do what's in the best interest of their taxpayers. But without this sort of tax increment financing, the market in and of itself is not going to be able to produce this level of intensity right now. And that was really the tug of war here, is if we created standards in statute that the school district and the counties and cities all knew you have to meet this standard, and then you have to demonstrate that you meet the but-for test, that but for this investment, the infrastructure doesn't get built, and then by extension, these housing units don't get built to this magnitude. You are always going to have some housing emerge around transit, but in terms of strategic planning near transit, the objective here is to really maximize that land. And that's an uncomfortable conversation for sure, where you're obligating somebody's tax increment, but it's to achieve this greater purpose, and at least thus far, I think the outcomes are very promising.
I think that's exactly right. There are two more comments we want to make before we move off of HTRZ. One is I'll direct to Benj and ask him to kind of talk to us about how we would use that tax increment stream of revenue to realize that into real dollars. But before we put that question to Benj, one of the things we found, we've been involved in a couple of these these HTRZ projects, and without naming names, I will say that certain taxing entities have come and said, we like this, we're in favor of this, we'll never vote for it. So you city, please go and get this application made, because this is the kind of product we need. We need a place for our county workers. We need a place for our school district employees. We need the kind of product that this kind of project would bring. And we like the fact that there's a process and it involves GOEO taking all those stakeholders and approving it, but it's only once the city is comfortable with making that application. So I think it's an example of where you can get through some of the hurdles that might otherwise prevent this kind of cooperative project. But then I guess the next question before we leave this topic is, Benj, do you want to just walk us through how it is that revenues coming from a tax increment area like an HTRZ would be utilized by city developers?
Historically, RDAs would pledge the tax revenue through an interlocal agreement to the developer as a reimbursement for costs spent or for hitting certain, construction high marks. And that could be, hey, we have a 20-year tax increment period. Developer, we're going to pledge for the next, every year, we're going to pledge a tax increment up to, $500,000 a year for the next 20 years. And that developer would collect that check and use it to reimburse themselves or pay for their infrastructure, and the development would just sort of occur as that happened. That's one way, just the direct reimbursement. Or the city could say, we'll issue bonds in order to put in this infrastructure, but that put the faith and credit and the bond on the financial books of the city, which some cities are a little bit against doing for what might be seen as more private development. The other option is creating a district, which we'll talk about here in the next slide, and saying, let's take all of those promise of those future revenues, that $500,000 a year for the next 20 years, and let's turn that into like a $6 or $7 million bond that we can use up front, put in our infrastructure now, and those be paid back by that TIF over time. By setting up a public infrastructure district, which is our next thing, that's not going on the books of the city, doesn't impact the credit or the financial status of the city. And this is why this tool is now becoming much more popular as a way to bring forward the HTRZ dollars and use them now to really get the most benefit out of that infrastructure.
Exactly. And we're going to jump into just a few slides on that. Oh, go ahead, John. John Brems.
So, a couple questions. How far away from a transit facility can you be? Is there any capacity in Salt Lake City for a new one? And what can you spend the money on?
Cam, do you want to take, so there's a radius rule, about a third of a mile or half a mile, depending on the product type. Or not, it's a third or a quarter.
It's a third a mile for fixed rail, quarter mile for the BRT, which is a little different than station area plans, which I referenced earlier. Station area plans are half a mile for fixed rail and quarter mile for BRT. And then the density is 50 units to the acre for fixed rail, and I think 39 units to the acre for BRT. I have my handy dandy cheat sheet, which we'll distribute here for folks, that talks through some of the definitions for HTRZs and the other tools that came from this past legislative session, because we don't expect anybody to remember all of it all the time. So we'll pass these out here in a second. But then your question, what could be spent on, I'll let you guys hit that. But the question about Salt Lake City is an interesting one, because there's Okay, well,
capacity?
both of those are interesting questions, and because yes, in Salt Lake County there is a cap on the aggregate number of HTRZs and FIZs. We're not at that cap yet. The cap is 11,
11 right
combined HTRZs and FIZs. So yes, in Salt Lake County you could apply for a FIZ or an HTRZ, and then once the committee at GOEO approves it, it goes toward that cap. And that cap was negotiated in good faith with Salt Lake County, and I said a moment ago, I'll say it again, like I totally get their argument of when the state starts obligating through the committee, even for a really good purpose, and tax dollars that could be spent on other things, that does limit the ability of the county or school district to meet other financial needs that they have. And so in Salt Lake County, because transit is so focused in Salt Lake County, not to folks in Saratoga Springs anything they don't already know, the transit's primarily in Salt Lake County rather than elsewhere in the area. Salt Lake County was concerned that if every stop turned into an HTRZ, they wouldn't have any property tax revenue left for other services. So that's why there's a cap in Salt Lake County. There's not a cap in the other counties because there are fewer numbers of applicable stations.
And well, to answer your question on what you could use that for, let me just give you a couple more slides, then we're going to jump into districts. Here's one that was done in South Jordan. The range of uses that could be for this particular revenue stream is rather broad. It's typically your wet infrastructure, so your storm, your sewer, your culinary. It's also, you can use it for parking structures. And then if you start getting into the district tools we're going to talk about in a minute, you can then broaden that out into potentially your dry infrastructure like gas or electric. And you can always use it for roads as well. But there's actually even a broader range when you start getting into the district discussions. But I thought this was important to see because this came from a GOEO application. And what it represents is an effort to just not make it only be housing, but to also incorporate it in some place that people are going to want to be and that provides some other community amenities. So this is part of where the Bees Stadium is being built. And then you have some nice art like that. This is another one that got approved early. This was a second, well, first or second, depends on how you time it. But this was in Vineyard, and one of the interesting things about the HTRZ is they're going to achieve incredible densities here at this front runner stop in Vineyard. But let me just show you one item. One of the things that was in their GOEO application is the fact that you're typically topped out at about 8 floors, 3 of which are parking when you're talking about a type of construction that's economical and that most projects can do. You can use this HTRZ money to go and finance an even more dense product, which is considered type 1 construction. And in this example, while it has the same number of floors, you could be going up to 20, 25 floors. Not saying that's what's going to happen, but when you switch to all concrete and steel, there's an incremental extra cost associated with that type of construction. But some cities are making the judgment that, hey, we only have so much land. We want to get as much of this type of product on that land. We'll use some of this increment to finance this more expensive construction technique. So anyway, just wanted to kind of offer that in terms of what you're talking about, John, about uses. Go ahead, Brian.
Will they make that way? Will the increase in cost be completely financed through this mechanism?
So the way it works is that it's used as an offset for other items that are qualifying. So it frees up other capital to go to this more expensive construction type. But that's the trade.
Okay.
By going to this more expensive construction type, you're able to then get access to that increment.
That's the but-for test.
Yeah, it's the but-for test, exactly. So as Ben's just indicated, this is something that is useful because you can use these districts that we're about to talk about in conjunction with HTRZ or without the HTRZ, but it can become more efficient sometimes to use them with use HTRZ increment with a district. But there have been some recent changes. So PIDs have been around, they're on the left column for now 5 years. And I'll have Ben kind of talk a little bit about how they've been adopted and utilized across the state. But then there's a brand new one that went into effect in May called an IFD. And this is a quick summary of some of the distinctions. And I'd ask Cam to kind of fill in any extra details. The IFD one, just so you know from my perspective as representing developers, is primarily oriented to lot development. I think there's some maybe creative ways you could try to make them work for commercial, but they're typically oriented to lot development, horizontal development. A couple reasons why. They have to be paid off when C of Os are issued, so the debt doesn't continue. They can be developer initiated, but there are some limits on their use. And you know, and as we say here, there's some ways that they can be used for certain dry infrastructure like electrical, but that's pretty rare. It's typically for roads and wet infrastructure. I don't know if you want to add anything to the IFD or the PID initially.
Yeah, simply that when PIDs came out in Utah, Benj, is it fair to say there was a lot of hesitation?
Sure.
Right? And then COVID hit, and it took a while before we really had a good test case. And there's still some hesitation, but I think the hesitation has started to lessen over the last few years. And then with IFDs are basically like a second cousin of PIDs. And the IFD tool, the legislature enacted it this year, and we were involved in drafting it. And ultimately, the benefit here is the city benefits from it, but the city doesn't have risk from it, and the future home buyer doesn't have ongoing risk from it. And those were a couple of really big, important details about it. Again, our cheat sheet walks through some of this.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, Benj, before we go into the mechanics of what are the revenues that can come from a district, why don't you just kind of give us a sense of how, you know, cities and authorities have been adopting these? If you can give us
Sure. So as Wade said, PIDs have been around 5 years. Initially, you probably heard of some larger projects that they were associated with, which was MIDA, the Deer Valley Mayflower ski resort, Utah Inland Port, kind of these larger projects with authorities that were difficult for people to really wrap their minds around. Now becoming much more common as city councils have learned more about them, as developers have understood the benefit of the tool, and you're seeing these in residential neighborhoods in Salem or all throughout southern Utah, or industrial parks in Tooele County, or really all up and down the Wasatch Front, southern Utah, all along the Wasatch back, not just in resorts, but in standard residential neighborhoods, mixed-use communities. If you think about it, they can be on a very small scale. It could be as small as funding maybe $1 million in infrastructure up to hundreds of millions. But of the significant, really big significant projects in Utah that have major infrastructure needs, if you just go down the list, almost all of them will be or have been partially funded by PIDs. You have Black Desert, which you all heard of down in southern Utah, huge PID component there. Utah City PIDs will have a big role there. Point of the Mountain, major role, PIDs there. The Deer Valley East, the Utah Inland Port and all of its different areas will have the option there. Some of them already utilize PIDs, others will in the future. Really these major infrastructure projects that are driving a lot of Utah's recreation business, their transportation and logistics, their job growth centers, really happening through public infrastructure districts. The IFDs, again, are a newer tool, and as Wade said, while the public infrastructure district, that has to be city approved and created, and then the city is removed from any type of liability there. But that is city approved and created because it allows for you to use revenues that are associated with the property to finance bonds. And that could be a tax increment that's associated with the property. It could be adding a new tax rate so that whatever growth that you're adding, this is a way for growth, paying for growth, whatever growth you're adding is going to pay for those bonds. Other fees associated with the property, impact fees, sales tax that's being generated, hotel tax, that can all come through a public infrastructure district. The IFD is a little bit different tool in that it does not require city approval. It's ultimately approved by property owners, whoever's in that area, the lieutenant governor. It's all under the purview of the lieutenant governor's office. But that doesn't have that same impact to a city as saying, hey, in a PID, a city would say, well, we want to know where revenues are occurring, what they're funding. In an IFD, those revenues that are supporting a bond those bonds have to be paid off before you get a certificate of occupancy. So there's less of an impact to an end user in terms of still having taxes to pay. Now, it's still beneficial to developers in that they get lower cost of financing, as we showed on that slide, which ultimately should filter through to a more efficient market in terms of costs. When you look at PID revenue sources, in the most basic concept, you look at bonds, you're really looking at three things here. What's going to pay the bonds? That would be the revenue sources. And that could be a mill levy, a new tax rate that's put on the property. Property tax increment, if it's available, and that can happen through an HTRZ. Sales tax, if you're generating new sales tax, impact fees could be used as a revenue source, and then like hotel taxes, other revenues associated with the property. Second consideration on a bond is who is issuing that bond. If that's the state of Utah issuing the bond, it's going to be the state of Utah's faith and credit, and they'll back it with sales tax, and it'll be some 3.5% rate. But that's not likely to happen for your Point of the Mountain or Utah City development or your neighborhood in Salem, Utah. The city most likely is not going to want to issue those bonds. And so the PID then now becomes an issuer, becomes its own separate entity that can issue bonds. And most importantly, it can issue tax-exempt bonds. Tax-exempt bonds meaning that bond buyers are exempt from federal and typically state income taxes. And if it's tax-exempt bonds, the uses there have to be for publicly related infrastructure. And that's really the best case scenario there for these bonds is these revenue sources, a PID, and being used for a variety of uses, including parks, sometimes parking garages, streets, sewer, wastewater, lots of different options there. But really think of it as a very low-cost, efficient way to pay for some of that early stage infrastructure without the developer having to go acquire high-cost equity, carries much more risk. These are bond buyers who are going to say, great, we know this is a long-term build-out project. We're not going to see any vertical construction for maybe a year or 2 years. These bonds are structured specifically to take, to take and understand and underwrite that risk. That's really what the PID is there.
And so if we kind of summarize this PID topic, and again, we may not have answered any of your questions. You may have a lot more, and if there's time at the end, we'll get to it. But there are some benefits that are obvious. For cities, you get better infrastructure. You're not creating liability. Property owners can get better amenities, faster completions, more stable prices, and then, of course, lower costs of financing, which will create efficiencies in the market. One thing that's brand new this year and is something that resulted from some legislation is what we call colloquially HB 572 low interest loans. And so far, we're only aware of one entity that's taken advantage of it, which is great. I mean, it's just brand new. But we happen to have Lacey here representing that entity. So we thought we would ask Lacey to just walk us through a little bit about what it is that this tool does. And Cam, feel free to jump in because I know you were involved in the drafting. And then how is it that it became attractive for your company?
Okay, thanks. So yeah, we are currently in the process of, we're pretty far into the process. We're hoping to get our first loan in the next couple weeks utilizing this funding. It's kind of the simultaneous thrill and terror of building the airplane while you're flying it. There have been some tweaks along the way. Our lender's been great to work with. We know that we're the guinea pig and they're the guinea pig, and the state's been wonderful to work with. As the little things have come up and we've said, hey, did anybody think about this? And they've said, oh, let's fix that, let's clarify that. So our anticipation is that it will be an even better program by the time the second person comes along to use it. It is lower interest. Brian familiarized you with our project up in Western Weber County earlier, and as we looked at that, we looked at all the different ways, as you looked at that stack that Wade had on one of his first slides, all the different things that factor into the cost of those homes and where we could affect that and lower that and make those homes attainable for more Utahns. And one of those is the financing costs. So with the HB 572 funding, it's available for both horizontal development, so putting in all the utilities, the roads, all that stuff, and then it's also available for vertical development, so for the construction of the actual homes. So this was a great fit for our project. As Tammy mentioned in the earlier presentation, because integration was important to us and to Weber County, we capped our village areas at no more than 80% of the homes in each village would be attainable homes, just to preserve that integration and that larger community feel. With the legislation, you are required to have at least 60% of the homes being financed in that loan request meet the attainability standard. So this was a good fit for us because we were already close to those numbers anyway. So these are our first 12 homes that we're doing right here. These are all starter homes that meet that attainability standard. So if you look, our first application has gone in for a chunk of homes right here that is a 60-40 split of market rate and starter homes. that meets those funding requirements. Go to the next one, Wade.
Yeah, you bet.
Thanks. So yeah, it's the lower interest rates reduce those carry costs for us. We're hoping to use it for both the horizontal and the vertical. Now, something to keep in mind, and Cam can probably add to this a little bit, is just that currently there's a sunset. If I had to guess, I would guess that, you know, based on success of the program, that may be extended in the future, but right now that's a pretty tight time frame where the loan has to be repaid pretty quickly. So there are certain things that it's a good fit for and certain longer term things that it's not currently a great fit for.
Yeah, Cam, can you maybe offer a little bit about how the cities viewed this tool and some of the interests that had to be weighed as this was created?
Sure. Last December, you saw some of the clip from the Nielsen presentation earlier of when Governor Cox introduced his starter home initiative at the West Haven Nielsen Homes project. And at that press conference, he announced Steve Waldrop was going to be his new senior housing advisor. And Steve got to work that morning, meeting with all the different stakeholders. And really, House Bill 572 came out of a lot of those conversations about how do we put a shot in the arm for builders who were, you were talking about the high interest rates earlier, but who were faced with some of these restraints on financing. Was there a way to use some of the state, for lack of a better term, reserves to provide those low interest loans to builders directly, so long as the builders met certain ownership and affordability criteria? And one key link through the tools we're pivoting to here is when you talk about a PID or an IFD, there are no requirements for what the output is. There's no requirement that X% has to be affordable or owner occupied. With HTRZs, there is a requirement for affordability, and then there's a requirement to consider ownership. But with House Bill 572 and then the two other tools we'll touch on, those tools do require that output. So it's really insightful listening to Nielsen earlier talk about how they're doing that with deed restrictions, because they have to in order to qualify for this money. But this was, to Wade's question, how to get all the stakeholders at the table, because our members were saying, we're willing to take the tough votes if the outcome is the affordable home ownership units. And the builders were saying, okay, we're willing to build that, but here are some of the challenges we're facing on financing side. And then you throw the infrastructure piece on top of it. And the objective with House Bill 572 and the other bills is to bring everybody to the table and force everybody to stretch. So I applaud the project in West Weber County, and I appreciate you leading out and taking it on the chin, learning all the lessons. And part of the reason there was a sunset was because there was hesitation at the Capitol about how this program was going to work and should it be indefinite, and they really want to be a shot in the arm, and they didn't want to use the term pilot program, but that's kind of what it feels like. So I think as we see more projects come online, that'll help in the conversation around the sunset.
Brent.
When this bill was being discussed, I thought, and a lot of people that I talked to thought, including my clients, thought that it was going to be impossible to get to that threshold, that $400,000 threshold, right? Because even the teeniest homes are going to suffer more than that. So I know that Brian covered this to some extent before, but how would you get to that threshold? How would you get to where you're going to be able to sell a product for less than $100,000?
Well, the components, you've got your land cost, which is going to go up. So I would say that's the largest variable in all the legislation. That's the perfect stars aligning. It's like if that would have been variable, the property owners would have realized we were going to do the rental density, the price would have gone up, and none of this would have been possible. So that's the one component that if I could screen.
So you got a great deal on the land.
We got a good deal on the land, and if the legislature just gives some kind of a blanket, hey, here's your by right additional 10 units per acre or whatever they're going to say, then that's going to cause the pricing to go up, and I don't think that that's going to be a real possibility. It's not going to be a viable possibility. So that's the biggest variable in all of this, because our infrastructure costs are our infrastructure costs.
Yeah.
And we're monitoring those as closely as we can, but the big variable is our land costs. So our improvement costs are important for us to keep in mind, but that's really where the savings came in, and the additional density just kind of help us kind of wrap our arms around it and make it work.
So I got clients who would love to do this, but it sounds like what I'm going to have to tell them is you're just going to have to get lucky.
Or lock in your land first, and then let's go do it. But yeah, good points. Well, we have two more we want to cover, and then we want to open it up for even broader questions, even including on prior slides. But one of these is called the HOPS, which is the Home Ownership Priority Zone, which this is a priority of the many legislative leaders. And I thought Cam is the best to speak on these next two. So Cam, you want to kind of walk us through this?
Yep, I'll hit the hops and the fizz as part of
that'd
the
be great.
alphabet soup here. So now we're going to go back to tax increment. So we started with HTRZs, that's tax increment. Then we pivoted to district financing. Then we went to the low interest loans for builders. Now we're back to tax increment financing. With the HOPS, it is designed to get to parcels of ground that are 10 acres or less, and it's trying to finance the infrastructure challenges that cities often face. And the thought here was, if the city could upzone to at least 6 units to the acre, get an assurance from the builder that it would meet certain affordability and ownership requirements, that then the city could capture that property tax increment from the other taxing entities on a piece of ground smaller than 10 acres for that sort of infill type development. Because realistically, that's what this tool is designed for, is more infill as opposed to large scale greenfield development. So in a nutshell, that's the HOPS. Let's jump to Fizz. Fizz is also tax increment, and Fizz is going to finish where we started. Think of this as a mini HTRZ. Now, hopefully everyone's familiar with the Wasatch Choice vision around center style development. And when you think about center style development, we're in one right now here in the Cairns district in Sandy. Center style development starts with transportation connectivity, right? So you need to have that center, and that's where HTRZs, the stationary plans around transit connectivity. Well, if you think of it as a sliding scale, your highest intensity land use around transit stops makes a lot of sense. But then if you're trying to get to that next level down, what I'll refer to as the medium density center, we wanted to take the principles from the HTRZ, because we're seeing the success there, and try to apply them at a more of a medium level density, a medium scale center that wasn't fixed to the light rail, BRT, or front runner stops. And instead would be a mixed use commercial center that has housing and commercial and other things, but then in order, you'd still have a density requirement in order to capture the tax increment to pay for infrastructure, but you could actually, quote unquote, buy down your density requirement by counting housing units elsewhere in the city that met certain density requirements, and then the affordable home ownership requirements could apply both in the center itself and in those extraterritorial housing units. And yes, it's extraterritorial. Multiple times we flubbed that during the session with extraterrestrial. And it's called the First Home Investment Zone. The original name for it was the Starter Home Investment Zone. And you can see why they told us they had to change that acronym. So nevertheless, think of it this way. You've got your traditional commercial center, and if you're a city, say, like, it would make sense to put some housing in that area. Well, the concept here is, yes, you can do that housing, but you couldn't do an HTRZ there because you don't have enough density, you don't have a track stop. But you still need some money for infrastructure there. So if you do some of the housing here, but then some of the housing over here elsewhere in your city, but it meets that density requirement, then the city can require that those single family detached homes over here are deed restricted to be owner occupied and affordable, and it counts towards your density requirement in the center, which then triggers the tax increment to pay for the infrastructure both here and there. That's the concept. Wade referenced that nobody's used it yet, and that's because there was a drafting error that one of our city attorneys caught 2 weeks after the session. And when he called me, he said, "This is what it says." I said, "No, it doesn't say that," because I knew what it was supposed to say. And then sure enough, when I went back and read it, that's what it said. And so the calculation was drafted incorrectly in the bill and doesn't work. But Steve Waldrop's committed to fix it, as has the bill sponsor. So it'll get fixed in January. But again, think of HTRZs as your high intensity center, Fizz as your medium density center, HOPS as your infill, 572 as helping the developer with the low interest loans to finance affordable owner occupied starter homes, and then PIDs and IFTAs at helping finance large scale infrastructure and other needs.
Yeah, one last comment, then we'll turn to questions. These tools are useful to not only cities that have large green fields, so you got to go develop a new land, turning farmland. It's also for the infill opportunity. And I like how Cam talked about how this provides an opportunity for that. So if you have brownfield or an infield, these tools can help make it so that these developments happen in a way that's consistent with what are the goals of the city and what will end up kind of stitching together parts that maybe have gaps in their community currently. Any questions from the group on any of these tools? Anything that we didn't get a chance to cover? John?
So this may show my stupidity, but I'm dealing with the back end of the PID.
Okay.
It's already been established. And we put a provision in there that the city would have an option to take over the PID. And now they're designing the system. And I just have this parade of horribles running through my head is, are they designing it right? Who's going to check it? Does it even have to be passed by an engineer?
So,
But I didn't think of that when we did the PID in the first. I could have put that all in the.
well, the PID bill talks about it built. So the PID legislation talks about it being built to city standards, or those who are going to be receiving the dedication. I see Cam nodding his head because that was a requirement. Well, the infrastructure itself, whether the city exercises the option to buy, I don't know the particulars of but if I was just to fly and address it from 30,000 feet, my thought would be it's infrastructure or something getting built, and it would eventually potentially be owned by the city, then it'd have to be built to city standard.
Exactly, yeah.
Or the city can reject it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It still has to go through all city codes and permits and approvals and
Inspections.
inspection, everything. It really just becomes a financing district to issue bonds to pay for the infrastructure. But it doesn't give any land use authority, doesn't give any rights in terms of designing your own infrastructure. It all has to fit within city code plans.
So get your inspectors out there. Any other questions? Well, go ahead.
I'm just curious what the turnaround time is. Every jurisdiction or city is going to be different, but once it's submitted to the state, what's the expectation for going up?
So for HTRZ, there is an economic analysis study that has to be done. So in our experience, I think it was, about 2.5 months to get that done. So imagine preparing the application, which is not easy. You got to kind of line up a lot of things to have a lot of discussions. You get that turned in, the economic analysis done, that goes to GOEO, and then they convene the meeting. I think we got the whole HTRZ from application to approval in like 3.5, 4 months.
Yeah, and Farmington's right here, right? Your process, I'm trying to remember the time frame there with
It was like
about that, 4 or 5 months. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Vantage is one of the folks who does that economic analysis.
No,
Which
we.
Zions or not.
Yeah, you'd use like a Zions Bank or.
And GOEO hires that out. So you pay for it as the applicant, but GOEO hires it out. They select. Yeah. Any others? Go ahead, sir.
On the infrastructure financing districts, the problem is that there's no long-term liability to the final property owners. I believe was stated, like the consumer.
Yeah.
What protections were put in place to accomplish that, and when is the infrastructure become public?
It may become public earlier, but the deal is with the bondholders, when they're buying their bonds, they know that their rights to recovery are terminated upon C of O, so they arrange in their loan documents for them to get a takedown or a component of payoff at the time that a C of O is issued. You want to add more to that?
Just the statutory requirement on the IFD is that for a residential IFD, that lien cannot continue past certificate of occupancy. So the minute that certificate of occupancy is issued, lien has to be removed. On commercial property, that lien can continue, but you're not. That's commercial is different than the residential.
Is there notification requirements to the property owner on a commercial, like saying there's this lien in place, and what? Because one of the concerns that I've heard from cities is basically that they are accepting a hidden tax. These property owners are, that they aren't aware of, and that then later puts their property at risk in one way or another.
They may be making that claim more towards PIDs, a little bit different than the IFD, and that is typically a property tax that continues on for the life of the bonds, typically 30 years. That is very well noticed. It's required so that in any transfer of the property, in the same way that you're in an HOA or any other covenants that exist with the land, you know about these things, but you've bought a house before, and people sign a lot of documents, and they're not always alert as to what they're signing. But there's some significant notification rules that are required that when you move into a district, that it is to be very known that we are paying these taxes. This is different than other taxes. You're within this district. This district is intended to last for X number of years. That's with PIDs if there's a tax rate associated with it. If the bonds are just being paid by property tax increment, no one would ever know. Because it's just your same taxes, instead of going system-wide, they're being put back into your area. So only if there's an added tax on your property would there be some type of notification that you're paying an additional tax. So yes, it's incumbent upon the district, or just say to make sure everyone is very aware of the taxes there. And an IFD, there wouldn't be anything because that gets removed. Now, if it's commercial, sure, if you're buying it from a property owner, that's going to show up on a title report, and they'll say yes.
They'll adjust the price based on that requirement.
Exactly. Yeah.
But Brendan, I'm really glad you asked that, because this was a key sticking point as we were negotiating on IFDs, because with PIDs, the city has to sign off on the creation of the PID, so therefore the elected officials who are responsible for decisions around tax policy are signing off up front that yes, there will be a different property tax on Brent's property because Brent's in the PID versus your property, Brandon, because you're not in the PID. But those elected officials are signing off up front. And we have seen horror stories in other states, not here, but in other states, of where, like in Colorado with metro districts and elsewhere, where there weren't safeguards in place, and you did have that hidden tax concept for those future residents. IFDs, we agreed that a builder or a property owner could create their own district. Our anxiousness was those aren't elected officials. They shouldn't be allowed to essentially levy a tax in perpetuity to pay back the bonds. The infrastructure financing district infrastructure still has to meet all the city standards. So we still are the land use approval body. We're still the land use authority, but then the financial piece is outside of our hands. That's why cutting it off at C of O was so important, so that you didn't have that hidden tax progressing with future home buyers. So it's a key distinction between the two, and there's a good reason for that distinction, and ultimately we thought we got to good policy on both reasons.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm very new to this, so tell me if I'm getting this right or not. So a PID, the developer applies for the PID, which the city or county has to approve it.
Right.
If approved, the city or county collects the taxes. They try and become the fiduciary, and that they have to then pay the bond back, so they're taking on that responsibility? How does that work?
Good question. The county does collect the tax because it's part of the tax collection, but that tax goes to the district. The district then is responsible for paying the bonds. There's no financial responsibility to the county, to the city. If the bonds are in default or don't make those payments, that does not come back to the county or the city. That's the risk the bondholders take. That's why instead of this being a state-backed bond, it's a PID issued bond. And so there is more risk there to bondholders. So there's a little higher.
The county collects.
Same way they collect it for the library and for the sewer district and for the water district and separate parks district or whatever, they collect it. And then as they distribute it to those entities, it just goes right to the PID, and the PID uses that to pay for the bonds.
The developer?
Yes. Well, in the initial years when it's created,
And then it's HOA?
and then it kind of works almost like an HOA. It transitions into property homeowners as the project is built out.
So under HB 572, how small can a project be? I noticed the Weaver County one's very large. I mean, can you do a 17-lot subdivision? Something that small? Okay.
It's a percentage of the funded homes. That is the requirement, and then a price component. that will adjust, but yeah, those are the metrics. Well, good. Well, thanks everyone for your time today, and thank you, Cam, for bringing a cheat sheet in case you start dreaming of alphabets tonight. You can get your mind straight tomorrow. But thanks again, everyone. Appreciate it.